3 months after the crisis at the mining colony, Jake found himself in the most unusual situation of his career. He was sitting in the captain's ready room aboard the Healing Dawn while Dr. Kelthara formally apologized for her treatment of him, and Captain Osin wrote a report that would change medical regulations throughout the galaxy. Dr. Murphy, Dr. Kelthara, said, "I have practiced medicine for over 3 centuries, and I believe that my experience gave me wisdom. But you taught me that wisdom without humility is merely arrogance. I formally request your forgiveness for my dismissive behavior." Jake looked at the Threnody doctor who had spent weeks studying his methods and interviewing the patients he had treated. She had been forced to admit that her advanced medical training had not prepared her for a problem that required emotional intelligence rather than technical knowledge. "Dr. Kelthara," he said, "you have nothing to apologize for. You were following the best medical practices known to your species. The fact that human methods worked in this case does not mean that alien methods are wrong. It means that different problems require different approaches." Captain Osin looked up from her report and fixed Jake with her crystalline gaze. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "I am recommending to Galactic Medical Command that the requirement for human physicians on medical ships be strengthened rather than eliminated. Your success at the colony has demonstrated that human medical practices offer unique capabilities that complement rather than compete with alien methods." The door chimed, and Dr. Lisa Kane entered carrying a data pad filled with information that had arrived from medical facilities throughout the sector. She had been promoted to Assistant Chief of Psychological Medicine and was now responsible for training other medical staff in human treatment methods. "The results keep coming in," Lisa said with obvious excitement. "Medical ships that have implemented your buddy system and group therapy protocols are reporting success rates that exceed anything we have seen before. The Andromedan Medical Institute wants to send a team to study our methods. 3 different species have requested human medical advisors for their planetary health systems." Jake felt overwhelmed by the response to what he had considered basic human medical practice. The idea that emotional support and social connection could be powerful healing tools seemed obvious to him, but it had been revolutionary to alien medical science. "The most interesting development," Captain Osin said, "is that other species are beginning to recognize similar gaps in their own medical practices. The Zelkari have started incorporating intuitive diagnosis into their logical protocols. The Threnody are learning to balance empathic healing with practical psychological intervention. Your human approach has inspired everyone to expand their methods." Dr. Kelthara nodded and activated a holographic display that showed medical data from across the galaxy. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "your success has forced us to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about the nature of healing. We focused so intensely on biological processes that we forgot that most species are social beings whose health depends on more than just physical function." The display showed statistics that demonstrated the impact of Jake's innovations. Recovery times for psychological conditions had decreased by an average of 40% on ships that used human counseling methods. Patient satisfaction ratings had increased dramatically when medical staff was trained to consider emotional as well as physical needs. Most importantly, medical emergencies that involved multiple species were being resolved more quickly when human physicians were part of the treatment team. "The question now," Captain Osin said, "is how to implement these discoveries on a galactic scale. We cannot simply assign human doctors to every medical facility in known space. There are not enough of them, and many species would resist the change." Jake had been thinking about this problem since his success at the mining colony. "Captain," he said, "I do not think every medical facility needs a human doctor. but every medical facility needs someone who can think like a human doctor, someone who understands that healing is about more than just treating symptoms. "What do you mean?" Dr. Kelthera asked. Jake stood and walked to the holographic display showing medical facilities across dozens of star systems. "Human medicine works because it considers the whole person rather than just the disease," he said. "But that approach can be learned by any species that is willing to expand their perspective. Zelkari doctors can learn to trust their intuition. Threnody healers can learn to address practical psychological needs. Other species can develop their own versions of holistic medicine." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "We could create training programs that teach human medical philosophy rather than just human medical techniques," she said. "Show alien doctors how to see patterns that their instruments might miss, and how to understand that patients are complex beings with emotional as well as physical needs." Captain Osin made notes on her datapad as they spoke. "This is a practical approach," she said. "We can establish medical exchange programs where human physicians work with alien doctors to develop hybrid treatment methods that combine the best of both approaches." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Galactic Medical Command. Admiral Chen's image appeared on the main screen, and she looked pleased as she addressed the group. "Captain Osin," she said, "I have reviewed your report on the mining colony incident and Dr. Murphy's innovative treatment methods. Galactic Medical Command has voted unanimously to establish a new medical specialty called xenopsychological medicine with Dr. Murphy as the founding director." Jake felt his heart skip a beat as he processed what the Admiral was saying. "Admiral," he said, "I am honored by this opportunity, but I am not sure I understand what you are asking." "Dr. Murphy," Admiral Chen said, "we want you to develop training protocols that will teach medical personnel throughout the galaxy how to integrate psychological and social factors into their treatment methods. You will work with representatives from every major species to create a new standard of care that addresses the complete needs of patients rather than just their biological symptoms." Dr. Kelthera placed a hand on Jake's shoulder in a gesture of support and respect. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "this is recognition that human medicine offers something unique and valuable to the galaxy. You have earned the right to shape medical practice on a scale that few physicians ever achieve." The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but Jake also felt excited by the possibilities. "Admiral," he said, "I accept this position, but I want to make it clear that I do not see this as replacing alien medical methods. I see it as enhancing them by adding human insights about the connection between mind and body. That is exactly the attitude we hoped you would have." Admiral Chen said, "Your first assignment will be to establish training centers on 12 different worlds where human and alien physicians can work together to develop new treatment protocols. You will have unlimited resources and the full support of Galactic Medical Command." After the communication ended, Jake sat quietly for several minutes processing the changes that were about to transform his life. Lisa was already making plans for the training programs, and Captain Osin was drafting personnel requests for the new medical centers. Dr. Kelthera was studying human medical texts that Jake had recommended to help her understand the philosophical foundations of his approach. Dr. Murphy, Captain Osin said, "There is one more thing you should know. Galactic regulations now require that no medical ship may engage in multi-species operations without at least one physician trained in human psychological medicine aboard. The regulation that you once thought was meaningless has become one of the most important safety requirements in space. Jake smiled as he thought about how much had changed since his first day aboard the Healing Dawn. He had arrived feeling like an unwanted burden whose primitive methods had no place in advanced galactic medicine. Now he was being asked to help reshape medical practice throughout known space. "Captain," he said, "I have one request for my new position." "What is that?" she asked. "I want to keep working on medical ships like this one," he said. "Training programs and research centers are important, but I want to continue treating patients and learning from real medical emergencies. The best way to develop new methods is to keep practicing medicine at the most challenging level." Captain Osen smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he had seen her express genuine warmth. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "I was hoping you would say that. The Healing Dawn will serve as your mobile headquarters, and you will continue to serve as our chief of xenopsychological medicine. Together we will prove that the most advanced medical ships in the galaxy always need physicians who understand that healing involves more than just technology." Jake looked around the ready room at his colleagues who had become friends and felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this moment. Human medicine had found its place in the galaxy not by competing with alien methods, but by offering something unique and valuable that complemented what others could provide. The future of galactic medicine would be built on cooperation and mutual respect rather than competition and dismissal. As the Healing Dawn received its next emergency call and prepared to, Jake began his treatment plan at dawn with the most severely affected patients. He had convinced Captain Osen to allow him to reorganize the medical bay according to human principles rather than alien efficiency. Instead of isolating patients, in individual healing chambers, he arranged them in groups where they could see and interact with each other. The alien medical staff watched with obvious disapproval as he moved equipment and rearranged furniture. "This goes against every principle of contamination control," Dr. Kelthera said as she watched Jake place Dex, the Corvin miner, next to Kira, the Faloran inspector. "If this condition is contagious, you are creating perfect conditions for it to spread, Jake looked up from adjusting a chair so that patients could face each other during conversation. "If this condition spreads through isolation, then we need to try the opposite approach," he said. "Sometimes the cure for a problem is the thing that seems most dangerous." Dr. Lisa Kane helped him set up what looked more like a community center than a medical facility. Chairs were arranged in circles instead of rows. Patients were encouraged to talk to each other instead of lying quietly in bed. The normal medical atmosphere of sterile silence was replaced with something that felt almost social. The first part of Jake's treatment involved addressing the biological effects of the fungus. He had studied the blood samples that Dr. Kelthera's scanners had dismissed as normal, and noticed subtle changes in stress hormone levels that the alien equipment had, not flagged as significant. Working with Lisa, he developed a treatment protocol that used mild anti-anxiety medications combined with compounds that would help the body process and eliminate whatever the fungus was producing. But the real innovation was the psychological component of his treatment plan. Jake had realized that the alien approach to medicine focused entirely on fixing problems rather than preventing them. Human medicine had learned that sometimes the best treatment was helping patients help themselves. He began with group sessions where patients could describe their experiences to others who understood what they were going through. Dex spoke about his fear of the deep tunnels and how it had grown stronger each day until he could barely force himself to go underground. Kira described the feeling of being watched by invisible predators and how it made her want to hide in small spaces where nothing could sneak up on her. Other patients shared similar stories, and Jake noticed something remarkable happening. When The beings talked about their fears with others who had experienced the same thing. The anxiety began to lose its power over them. The symptoms were still real, but they became manageable when patients realized they were not alone in their suffering. "This is fascinating," Lisa whispered to Jake during one of the group sessions. "Look at their body language. They are relaxing for the first time since we brought them aboard." Jake watched as Dex's 4 arms stopped their constant restless movement, and Kira's ears came forward in a gesture that indicated reduced stress in her species. The conversation had shifted from describing symptoms to sharing coping strategies, and the patients were teaching each other ways to manage their anxiety. The breakthrough came on the second day when Jake introduced what he called environmental therapy. Instead of keeping patients in the sterile medical bay, he arranged for them to spend time in different parts of the ship where they could experience normal social interaction. The ship's observation deck became a healing space where patients could look at stars while talking to crew members about subjects that had nothing to do with their illness. Dr. Murphy, Captain O'Seen said, as she found him in the observation deck with a group of patients who were laughing at a story one of the Zelkari engineers was telling. "I must admit that your patients appear to be improving, but I do not understand how this is possible." Jake gestured toward Dex, who was engaged in animated conversation with 3 crew members about mining techniques. "Captain," he said, "the fungus created a biological vulnerability to anxiety, but the real damage came from psychological isolation. When beings are alone with their fears, those fears grow stronger. When they share their fears with others, the fears become smaller and more manageable. But our medical protocols require isolation to prevent contamination," she said. "Your medical protocols assume that all illness spreads through physical contact," Jake replied, "but this condition spreads through psychological isolation. The more you isolate patients, the sicker they become. The more you connect them with others, the faster they heal." Dr. Kelthara appeared in the observation deck looking confused and slightly angry. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "I have been monitoring your patients with our bioscanners and their improvement. Makes no scientific sense. Their brain chemistry is normalizing without any advanced medical intervention. How is this possible?" Jake smiled and pointed to a group of patients who were working together on a puzzle that one of the crew members had brought from their quarters. "Dr. Kelthara," he said, "your scanners can measure biological functions, but they cannot measure hope. They can detect stress hormones, but they cannot detect the relief that comes from knowing you are not alone. Sometimes healing happens in ways that instruments cannot measure." The real test came when Jake proposed taking his treatment plan to the colony itself. The mining operation was still shut down because too many workers were unable to function. The colonial governor had been demanding evacuation, but Jake convinced Captain Osen to let him try a different approach. "I want to go down to the colony and treat patients in their own environment," he said. "The fungus is still there, but I think we can teach people to live with it safely." Dr. Kelthara looked horrified. "Dr. Murphy, that is completely irresponsible," she said. "You would be exposing yourself to the very organism that has made hundreds of beings sick." "I would be exposing myself to an organism that makes people anxious," Jake corrected. "But anxiety can be managed if you have the right tools and the right support system." Captain Osen considered the proposal for several minutes before nodding slowly. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "you may proceed, but you will take a full medical team with you and maintain constant communication with the ship. If your condition deteriorates in any way, you will be evacuated immediately." Jake descended to the colony with Lisa and a small team of volunteers from both the medical staff and the ship's crew. The mining facility was larger than he had expected, with tunnels that extended deep into the planet's crust and living areas that housed thousands of beings from dozens of different species. The colonial administrator was a nervous Andorian named Commander Vale, who had been struggling to maintain order as more workers reported sick each day. "Dr. Murphy," he said, "I hope you can help us because we are running out of options. The mining consortium is threatening to abandon this operation entirely if we cannot solve this problem." Jake set up his treatment center in the colony's main social area rather than in the medical facility. He arranged chairs in circles and encouraged workers to attend group sessions where they could talk about their experiences with the fungus. He also organized work teams that paired experienced miners with those who were struggling with anxiety so that nobody had to face the tunnels alone. The most important innovation was what Jake called buddy mining. Instead of sending workers into the deep tunnels alone, he paired them with partners who could provide emotional support and reality checks when anxiety began to build. The partners were trained to recognize the early signs of fungus-induced anxiety and to use conversation and companionship to prevent the condition from becoming severe. Within a week, the colony was back to full operation. Workers who had been unable to enter the tunnels were returning to their jobs with confidence. The fungus was still present, but it was no longer causing debilitating illness because people had learned to manage its effects through social support and proper psychological preparation. Dr. Kelthera accompanied Jake on his final visit to the colony and watched in amazement as former patients worked alongside healthy crew members in apparent harmony. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "I must admit that your methods have achieved results that I would have considered impossible. How did you know that this approach would work?" Jake looked around at the busy colony where beings from many different species were working together and supporting each other. "Dr. Kelthera," he said, "human medicine has learned that healing is not just about fixing what is broken. Sometimes healing is about helping people find the strength they already have inside them. The fungus was real and the symptoms were real, but the cure was not a medication or a treatment. The cure was helping people remember that they do not have to face their fears alone." Jake woke before dawn and prepared for what might be his only chance to prove that human medicine had value in the galaxy. He gathered his old leather bag and filled it with simple tools that seemed primitive compared to the advanced equipment around him. A basic stethoscope that his grandfather had used, a small flashlight for examining pupils, a notepad and pen for writing observations by hand. The alien crew members who saw him preparing laughed quietly among themselves. Dr. Lisa. Kane found him in the corridor outside the medical bay. She was the only other human aboard the ship and worked as a nurse in the pediatrics section. Lisa was young and eager and had volunteered for deep space duty because she wanted to see the galaxy. She had been as isolated as Jake during their time aboard, but she approached him with obvious excitement. "I heard Captain Osen gave you permission to try human methods," she said. "Can I help you somehow?" Jake smiled and felt grateful to have at least one ally. "I need someone to take notes while I talk to the patients," he said. "Your nursing experience with different species might help me understand what I am seeing." They entered the medical bay together, and Jake felt the weight of everyone watching him. Dr. Kelthara sat at her workstation reviewing test results that still showed nothing abnormal. Captain Osin stood nearby with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she expected him to fail. Several other medical staff members had found reasons to be in the area so they could observe his primitive methods. Jake approached the first patient and sat down beside him rather than standing over him with scanning equipment. Dex the Corvin. Miner looked surprised by this approach since none of the alien doctors had taken time to sit and talk with him as an equal. Dex, Jake said, I want to understand what you are experiencing, but I need you to describe it in your own words rather than answering medical questions. The large being shifted uncomfortably, and his forearms moved restlessly as he spoke. It started in the deep mines where I work alone for 12 hours at a time, he said. The tunnels are dark and quiet, and you can hear strange sounds that might be rock settling or might be something else. I began feeling like something was watching me from the shadows, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. Jake nodded and made notes while Lisa listened carefully. Tell me about your dreams, he said. Not dreams exactly, Dex said. More like being awake but seeing things that are not there. Shapes moving at the edge of my vision. Sounds that do not belong underground. A feeling that something is following me even when I know I am alone. Jake spent an hour with Dex and learned details that no scanner could detect. The Corvin described how the illness had started after he found a new type of fungus growing in the deepest tunnels. It was pale blue and gave off a faint light that was almost pretty. He had reported it to his supervisors, but they told him to ignore it since it did not interfere with mining operations. The next patient was Kira, the Faloran female who worked as a tunnel inspector. Her job required her to crawl through spaces, too small for the larger miners, and check for structural problems. She described similar symptoms and mentioned the same blue fungus that seemed to be spreading through the lower levels of the mine. The fungus smells sweet, she said, like flowers that have been left too long in water. At first I thought it was harmless, but after a few days of breathing the smell I started feeling nervous all the time, like prey being hunted by something I could not see. Jake continued interviewing patients throughout the morning, and a pattern began to emerge. Every patient who showed symptoms had been exposed to the blue fungus. Every patient worked in isolated conditions where they spent long hours alone with their thoughts. Every patient described the same progression from normal nervousness to crippling anxiety to physical symptoms that made it impossible to work or sleep. But the most interesting discovery came when Jake talked to patients about their relationships with other beings. Those who had strong social connections before the illness showed milder symptoms. Those who were naturally solitary or had been isolated from their communities showed the most severe effects. Lisa, Jake said during a break, I think we are dealing with something that affects the mind first and the body second. The fungus might be releasing compounds that increase anxiety, but the real damage comes from psychological isolation. Dr. Kelthara overheard their conversation and approached with obvious skepticism. Dr. Murphy, she said, you are suggesting that a simple fungus can cause complex psychological symptoms across multiple species. That is scientifically impossible. Why is it impossible? Jake asked. We know that many earth fungi produce compounds that affect brain chemistry. Ergot causes hallucinations. Psilocybin alters perception. Why could not an alien fungus have similar effects? Because our bioscanners would detect any psychoactive compounds, she said. We have tested blood samples from every patient and found no foreign substances. Jake thought about this problem while he continued his interviews. The alien medical equipment was incredibly sophisticated, but it was designed to look for known pathogens and familiar chemical signatures. What if the fungus produced something that was too alien for the scanners to recognize as a threat? His breakthrough came when he interviewed a human maintenance worker who had been brought up from the colony. Pete Harrison was a quiet man who had volunteered for deep space duty to escape a failed marriage back on Earth. He described symptoms identical to the alien patients, but he was able to articulate his experience in ways that Jake could understand completely. "It is like having anxiety that feeds on itself," Pete said. "The more worried you get, the more worried you get about being worried. Your mind starts creating threats that do not exist because it is looking for reasons to justify the fear you are feeling. After a few days, you cannot tell the difference between real danger and imagined danger." Jake realized that Pete had described a feedback loop between the biological effects of the fungus and the psychological state of the patients. The alien doctors were treating the symptoms as separate problems, but they were actually parts of a single system that reinforced itself. "Lisa," he said, "I need you to help me test something. Can you find out which patients have been isolated since their symptoms started and which ones have been allowed social contact?" Lisa spent the afternoon gathering information while Jake continued his interviews. Her results confirmed his suspicion. Patients who had been quarantined alone showed worse symptoms than those who had been grouped together. Crew members who worked in teams were recovering faster than those who worked solo shifts. By evening, Jake had enough information to present his theory to Captain Osen and Dr. Kelthera. He found them in the main medical office reviewing the latest test results that still showed nothing useful. "Captain," Jake said, "I believe I understand what we are dealing with." Dr. Kelthera looked up from her workstation with tired eyes. "Dr. Murphy, please tell me you have found something, because we are running out of options. 2 more crew members showed symptoms today, and the colonial governor is demanding immediate evacuation." Jake sat down and opened his notepad filled with handwritten observations. "The blue fungus in the mines produces airborne compounds that increase anxiety and paranoia in most oxygen-breathing species," he said, "but the fungus alone is not causing the severe symptoms we are seeing." "Explain," Captain Osin said. "The real problem is a feedback loop between the biological effects of the fungus and the psychological state of the patients." Jake said, "The fungus makes people anxious, which makes them avoid social contact, which increases their anxiety, which makes the biological effects worse. It is like a spiral that feeds on itself until the patient becomes completely unable to function." Dr. Kelthara shook her head. "Your bioscanners show no evidence of psychoactive compounds," she said. "Because the scanners are looking for known substances," Jake replied. "This fungus might produce something completely alien that registers as harmless organic matter. The effects are real, but the cause is too foreign for your equipment to recognize." Captain Osen leaned forward with interest. "What do you propose as treatment?" Jake took a deep breath and prepared to suggest something that would sound completely unscientific to alien ears. "We need to treat both the biological and psychological components at the same time," he said. "Medical intervention to counteract the fungus plus social intervention to break the isolation feedback loop." "Social intervention," Dr. Kelthera said. "You want to cure a medical condition with conversation. I want to cure a complex condition with a complex solution." Jake said, "The mind and body are connected in ways that your scanners cannot measure. If we treat only the biology, we will fail. If we treat only the psychology, we will fail. But if we treat both together, we might succeed." The silence in the room stretched for long moments while both alien officers considered his proposal. Finally, Captain Osen spoke. "Dr. Murphy," she said, "you have 1 more day to prove your theory. If your human methods can help these patients, then we will implement your treatment plan. If not, then we evacuate the colony and declare this outbreak beyond our ability to treat." Jake nodded and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had identified the problem, but now he had to prove that human medicine could solve it. The mining colony on Kepler 442b appeared on the main screen as a collection of dark buildings scattered across a red landscape. Jake stood in the medical bay watching Dr. Kelthera and her team prepare for what they expected to be a routine medical emergency. The Threnody moved with practiced efficiency while Zelkari technicians calibrated scanning equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. Nobody seemed particularly concerned about what they would find on the surface. Preliminary. Scans show a population of approximately 8,000 beings representing 12 different species, reported Lieutenant Zara Kellens, a young Zelkari who operated the ship's bioscanners. The distress call mentioned widespread illness, but provided few details. Dr. Kelthara nodded and gestured toward a wall display that showed medical readings streaming in from the colony. "Standard viral outbreak, most likely," she said. "These mining operations bring together species that have no natural immunity to each other's pathogens. We have seen this pattern hundreds of times." Jake watched the data scroll past and tried to understand what he was seeing. The readings were far more complex than anything he had worked with during his training, but the basic patterns seemed familiar. Heart rates and breathing patterns and cellular activity levels all displayed in neat columns of numbers that meant everything to the alien doctors and very little to him. "Dr. Murphy," Dr. Kelthara said, without looking in his direction. "You may observe but do not speak unless spoken to. This is a delicate situation and we cannot afford any interference." The ship entered orbit, and within an hour the first shuttle arrived, carrying patients from the colony. Jake had expected to see beings who were obviously sick, but the patients who were brought aboard looked almost normal. They walked under their own power and responded to questions and showed few obvious signs of illness. But something was wrong, and Jake could sense it even if he could not identify what it was. The first patient was a Corvan male named Dex, who worked in the deep mines extracting rare metals from the planet's core. He was a large being with thick gray skin and 4 arms that ended in powerful claws designed for digging. When Dr. Kelthara approached him with her bioscanner, he flinched away and his breathing became rapid and shallow. "When did your symptoms begin?" she asked while taking readings with instruments that projected soft beams of light over his body. "3 days ago," Dex said. "Started with bad dreams, and then feeling like something was watching me all the time. Now I cannot eat, and my strength is leaving me, but I do not know why." The scanner beeped and displayed results that made Dr. Kelthara frown. "Your biological functions appear normal," she said. "All major systems are operating within acceptable parameters. Perhaps this is a psychological condition rather than a medical one." Jake watched the interaction and noticed things that the scanner could not measure. Dex kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected something to attack him. His hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was watching, and he kept touching his throat as if it was difficult to swallow. These were signs Jake recognized from his work with humans who suffered from severe anxiety, but he had never seen them in an alien species before. The next patient was a Faloran female named Kira, whose species resembled large cats with opposable thumbs. She displayed similar symptoms and gave similar descriptions of her illness. The bioscanner found nothing wrong with her either, but Jake could see that she was suffering in ways that the instruments could not detect. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Kelthara said to her Zelkari assistant. "The scanning equipment shows no sign of infection or disease, but clearly these beings are experiencing some form of distress." More patients arrived throughout the day, and all of them told similar stories. They described feeling watched and hunted and unable to rest or eat properly. Some spoke of nightmares that continued even when they were awake. Others mentioned a constant sense of dread that made it impossible to concentrate on their work. But the advanced medical scanners found nothing wrong with any of them. Captain Osin arrived in the medical bay as the situation grew more confusing. "Dr. Kelthera," she said, "I need answers. The colony administrator is reporting that productivity has dropped to almost nothing, and more workers are requesting evacuation every hour. What are we dealing with?" "Unknown at this time," Dr. Kelthera replied. "The symptoms suggest a psychological condition, but there is no known pathogen that affects multiple species in this manner. I am running deep tissue scans and genetic analysis, but so far every test comes back negative." Jake had been watching and listening for hours, and an idea was beginning to form in his mind. The pattern of symptoms reminded him of cases he had seen during his residency at a hospital near a chemical plant. Workers there had developed similar anxiety and sleep disorders after exposure to certain industrial compounds. But when he started to speak, Dr. Kelthara raised a hand to silence him. "Not now, Dr. Murphy," she said. "I must focus on finding a medical solution to this crisis." The situation became worse when 3 crew members from the Healing Dawn began showing the same symptoms. A Zelkari engineer named Torvin reported feeling paranoid and unable to sleep after working in the shuttle bay where the patients had been brought aboard. 2 Threnody healers complained of disturbing dreams and a sense of being watched by invisible enemies. "This changes everything," Dr. Kelthera said. "If the condition can spread to our crew, then we are dealing with a highly contagious pathogen. We must implement full quarantine protocols immediately." Jake watched as the medical team went into emergency mode. Force fields were activated to isolate the patients, and crew members began wearing protective suits that covered them from head to foot. The atmosphere in the medical bay became tense and frightened as everyone tried to avoid contact with anything that might be contaminated. But Jake noticed that the quarantine measures seemed to make the patients worse rather than better. Their anxiety increased when they were isolated, and their physical symptoms became more severe when they could not interact with other beings. This was not how infectious diseases normally behaved, and it suggested that something else was happening. "Dr. Kelthera," Jake said during a brief break in the emergency procedures, "I think we might be approaching this wrong. What if the illness is not purely biological?" She looked at him with frustration and exhaustion. "Dr. Murphy, I do not have time for human theories right now. 3 of my staff are now showing symptoms, and I have over 40 patients who are getting worse despite our best efforts. Unless you have concrete medical evidence to support your ideas, please remain silent." Jake felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but he could not shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The symptoms were real, and the suffering was obvious, but the traditional medical approach was not working. Every scan came back negative, and every treatment failed to provide relief. Meanwhile, more patients arrived from the colony, and more crew members began showing signs of the mysterious illness. As the day progressed, Jake noticed patterns that the alien doctors seemed to miss. The patients who were most severely affected were those who worked alone in the deep mines. The crew members who got sick were those who spent the most time isolated in their duties. The symptoms were worse at night, when the ship was quiet and people were alone with their thoughts. Jake also observed that patients showed improvement when they were allowed to interact with others and became worse when they were isolated. This was the opposite of what would happen with a contagious disease, but nobody seemed to notice because they were focused on their scanning equipment and test results. By the end of the day, Dr. Kelthera looked exhausted and defeated. I have tried every known treatment and consulted the medical databases of 17 different civilizations. She said, "Nothing explains these symptoms or provides effective treatment. Whatever this is, it is beyond our current understanding." Captain O'Seen entered the medical bay looking grim. "Dr. Kelthera, I need solutions, not problems. The colonial governor is threatening to declare a system-wide emergency if we cannot control this outbreak. Other ships are avoiding this sector and trade routes are being redirected. This illness is causing panic throughout the region." Jake knew that he was taking a risk, but he could not remain silent any longer. "Captain," he said, "I request permission to examine the patients using human diagnostic methods." Both alien officers stared at him as if he had suggested using magic crystals to cure cancer. Dr. Murphy, Dr. Kelthera said, "Your primitive techniques cannot possibly succeed where advanced galactic medicine has failed." With respect, Jake said, "Advanced galactic medicine has not succeeded either. Maybe it is time to try a different approach." "Captain." Osen looked between the two doctors, and Jake could see her calculating the risks and benefits of allowing him to proceed. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "Let me talk to the patients." Jake said, "Let me observe their behavior and ask questions that your scanners cannot answer. Give me one day to try human methods before you declare this outbreak beyond treatment." The silence stretched for long moments before Captain Osen finally nodded. "One day, Dr. Murphy," she said, "if you can provide any insight that helps us solve this crisis, then you will have proven your worth. If not, then you will return to your paperwork and never question our procedures again." Dr. Jake Murphy stepped through the airlock of the Healing Dawn and felt completely out of place. The medical frigate stretched before him like a crystal cathedral, with walls that seemed to glow from within. Everything was perfectly clean and organized in ways that hurt his eyes to look at for too long. The corridors were wide enough for 3 beings to walk side by side, and the ceiling curved high above his head with soft blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake carried his old medical bag in one hand and his transfer papers in the other. The bag looked ancient compared to everything around him. It was made of brown leather that his grandfather had given him when he graduated from medical school back on Earth. The corners were worn smooth from years of use, and it had scuff marks that told stories of emergencies in small towns and long nights in busy hospitals. Here on this ship, it looked like something from a museum. A tall figure approached him from down the corridor. Jake had never seen a Zelkari in person before, but he recognized the species immediately. Captain Vera Osen stood nearly 7 feet, tall, with skin that looked like it was made of pale blue crystal. Her features were sharp and angular, and when she moved, she made a soft chiming sound like wind through glass. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and she carried herself with the kind of precision that made Jake feel sloppy just by existing near her. "Dr. Murphy," she said, and her voice had an odd echoing quality that made it sound like she was speaking from inside a cave. "Welcome aboard the Healing Dawn." Jake nodded and tried to smile, but he could tell she was studying him the way someone might examine a broken piece of equipment they were not sure how to fix. "Thank you, Captain Osen," he said. "I am honored to serve aboard your ship." "The honor is mine, though I must admit I do not understand why regulations require your presence," she said without any attempt to soften her words. Your medical training is considered primitive by galactic standards, and this ship operates with the most advanced healing technology in known space. Jake felt his face grow warm, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard this before during his application process and his training for deep space assignment. Humans were tolerated in galactic medicine but not respected. They were seen as a necessary burden that regulations forced upon advanced medical facilities. "I understand your concerns, Captain," Jake said. "I hope to prove that humans can contribute something valuable to your medical team." Captain Osen made a sound that might have been amusement or might have been dismissal. "Dr. Kelthara will show you to your quarters and explain your duties," she said. "Do not expect special treatment because of your species. On this ship, competence is measured by results, not by sentiment." She turned and walked away, and Jake watched her go while wondering what he had gotten himself into. The job posting had been clear that he would be the only human aboard a ship with over 200 alien crew members. What it had not mentioned was how isolated he would feel, or how obvious it would be that nobody wanted him there. Another figure approached from the opposite direction, and Jake knew immediately this was Dr. Kelthara. The Threnodi were known throughout the galaxy as natural healers, and she was a perfect example of her species. She stood about Jake's height, but her body seemed to flow rather than walk. Her skin had a soft green tint, and her eyes were large and dark, with flecks of silver that seemed to move when she looked at him. She wore robes instead of a uniform, and they shifted color as she moved from deep green to pale blue. "Dr. Murphy," she said, and her voice was warm like honey, but there was something cold underneath it. "I am Dr. Kelthara, Chief Medical Officer of this vessel. You will report to me and follow my instructions without question." "Of course," Jake said. "I look forward to working with you and learning from your experience." Dr. Kelthara tilted her head and studied him with those strange, shifting eyes. "I have been healing the injured and sick for over 300 years, she said. "I have studied with the greatest medical minds in 17 different star systems. I can sense illness before it manifests and cure diseases that your primitive scanning equipment cannot even detect. What exactly do you think you could possibly teach me?" Jake took a deep breath and reminded himself that he had expected this kind of reception. "I do not presume to teach you anything," he said. "I am here to learn and to help however I can." "Good," she said. "Then follow me and I will show you where you will sleep and work. Try not to interfere with actual medical procedures." She led him through corridors that branched and curved in patterns that made no sense to Jake's human brain. The ship was enormous and seemed to be laid out according to some alien logic that he could not grasp. They passed medical bays filled with equipment that looked more like art installations than surgical tools. Healing chambers glowed with soft light and made humming sounds that were almost musical. Everything was clean and efficient and completely intimidating. "This is your quarters," Dr. Kelthara said as they stopped in front of a door that opened. At their approach, "It is larger than standard because humans require more space than most civilized species. Your medical station is 2 levels down in Bay 7. You will assist with basic procedures and handle any paperwork that requires human verification." Jake looked into his new quarters and saw a small room with a bed and a desk and a viewport that showed the stars outside. It was functional and clean, but felt more like a storage closet than a place to live. "Thank you," he said. "When do I begin my duties?" "Immediately," she said. "There is a supply inventory that needs to be verified and several forms that require a human signature for legal purposes. Nothing that requires actual medical knowledge." She handed him a data pad filled with lists and numbers, and Jake could see that she was giving him busy work to keep him out of the way. He had traveled 3 months through space to get here and spent 2 years training for this assignment, and now he was being treated like a clerk. "Dr. Kelthara," he said, "I hope you will give me a chance to prove that humans can contribute more than just paperwork to medical practice." She looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could see something like pity in her eyes. "Dr. Murphy?" She said, "I have worked with many species over the centuries, and I have learned that each has their strengths. Zelkari excel at logic and precision. Threnodi have natural empathic healing abilities. Vorthan possess incredible knowledge of biological systems. Humans have enthusiasm and good intentions, but those qualities do not save lives." "What about intuition?" Jake asked. "What about the ability to see patterns that logic might miss?" "Intuition is what primitive species call guessing," she said. "On this ship, we deal in facts and proven medical science. If you wish to contribute, then learn our methods and follow our procedures. Your human instincts will only get in the way." The conversation was interrupted by an alert that echoed through the ship. Captain Osin's voice came over the communication system, announcing that they had received a distress call from a mining colony and would be arriving within 6 hours. Jake felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of finally putting his skills to use, but Dr. Kelthara's expression made it clear that he would be observing rather than participating. "Come," she said. "You can watch real doctors work and perhaps learn something useful." Jake followed her toward the medical bays and wondered if he would ever get the chance to prove that human medicine had something valuable to offer the galaxy.